This morning, as we prepare to hear the scriptures read from the Old Testament, I want to invite you to do something a little unusual. I want you, if at all possible, to take your shoes off. If you have socks on, you might want to take those off as well. And take a moment to just let your feet feel the carpet or the floor, or even if you're outside, the ground, the grass. Take note of that sensation and know that we are truly on holy ground. And now hear this word from Exodus chapter 3.
Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. Then the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see. God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations.
So we have this story of Moses before the burning bush. But how did we even get here? What brought Moses to this point? Well, he had been born a child of the Israelites at a time when Pharaoh and the Egyptians had turned against the Israelites, had enslaved them, and had become so afraid of them that Pharaoh had decreed, that all male infants of the Israelites were to be killed as soon as they were born. But Moses' mother had made a different choice. She hid Moses, and when it was no longer possible to keep him hidden, had sent him down the river in a little basket. He was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, who made a very bold and courageous choice to save this child. And so she pulled him out of the water, and she is the one who named him Moses. And she raised him as her own child. But when Moses became an adult, and he was aware of his connection to the Israelites, he became very frustrated at how the Israelites were being treated, about the brutal treatment they received as slaves. And so in a situation where he saw this taking place, he actually killed one of the Egyptian slave masters. That put his life in danger. So he packed up and he headed out of town. And he went out into the wilderness, where he met a young woman and her family. He married her and took over her father's business of shepherding a flock. And it was on one of these times when he was out with the flock that he ended up at this place where he saw this bush. So he's really just minding his own business, taking care of his father-in-law's sheep. And he sees this bush. And this amazing thing happens. He sees in this bush an angel. And he also sees that the bush nor the angel are being consumed by the fire. And so he asks himself, what could this be about? Well, think about how you might react. What would your first thought be? I think mine would be, I'm out of here. But Moses allowed his curiosity to draw him closer to the bush. And you know, really, in truth, sometimes if we are to encounter God, we do have to take a risk. We have to let our curiosity lead us forward to see, what is this amazing thing taking place before me? Now, Moses had no idea where this encounter with God was going to lead him, but when he heard God's voice speak his name, Moses, Moses, he made the one reply that any of us should make when God calls us. Here am I. And that was the moment that changed his life and the lives of others forever. This encounter between God and Moses is truly monumental. What happens at this point becomes pivotal to the whole biblical story. It culminates over 1,000 years later in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is truly a holy and sacred moment. And this holy and sacred moment happens for just one reason. The Egyptians' fear of these Israelite foreigners had reached a point where they had turned what was once a healthy, symbiotic relationship into a reign of terror. And God has heard the cries of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians have forced into slavery. God has felt the grief caused by this decree of Pharaoh to kill their male children. Take a moment just to consider that. God hears the cries of the oppressed and the suffering, the cries of those who are abused by the powerful institutions, powerful governments and powerful people who seek to exploit and abuse them. We who have power because of our skin color, our gender, our wealth, our charisma, whatever, need to know that when we use that power in ways that are abusive, God is not on our side. And that's the message that Moses heard. God is not on the side of the Egyptians, and God has a plan to bring freedom to the Israelites. The Egyptians will need to choose. Will they submit to God's will and God's plan? Or will they be destroyed? But that's another story for another time. Right now, we want to focus on this particular encounter between God and Moses. And when God tells Moses that God has a plan and that it includes Moses, Moses is not happy. You know, sometimes when God calls our name, it's because God has a plan for our life that we didn't anticipate and may not, in the moment, appreciate. Some of us may be experiencing that right now as we have had to adapt the ways that we do our jobs, parenting, learning, just about anything else because of COVID. We had not anticipated this, but God has a plan. And when God shows up and pushes us out of our comfort zone, as many of us are right now, what we can trust is that God's plan is solid and that God's presence is very real. In a time like this, it may actually help us to ask the same two questions that Moses asks in this story. First, he asks, "Who am I?" In other words, he's asking God, what is it that you see in me, God, that I don't see in myself? What makes you think that I'm capable of doing this amazing and dangerous thing? Now, God's response seems to ignore Moses' question, but actually it may answer it more fully than anything else possibly could have done. Now, think about it. God could have recited Moses' resume, which frankly was pretty impressive up to that point. But instead, God simply says, "I'll go with you." When God calls us to do something way out of our comfort zone, it turns out that what is most important is not who we are or what we have to offer God, but the simple fact that God will be with us. The second question Moses asks is, "Who are you, God?" When I go to the Israelites with this crazy plan you've given me, when I stand before Pharaoh and demand that he let these people go, whose calling card will I be presenting as my credentials? Now, this is where things get really interesting, because you see, the Egyptian gods all had their own special names. Ra, Isis, Osiris, Horus, and thousands of other names for the many different gods that the Egyptians believed in. Moses wants to pinpoint this God who has just given him this mission impossible. But God will not allow himself to be pinpointed or nailed down. God doesn't need a name. God simply is, and God will be whom and what God chooses to be. It's on God's terms and no one else's. So God's response to Moses' first question of "Who am I?" is simply, "I will be with you." God's response to the second question, who are you, God, is even more simple. All God says is, I am. When God calls us to do something way out of our comfort zone, the only thing that we need to know is that God is, and that God will be whatever God needs to be to help us do the work that God has given us. In this world, at this time, there are a great many mission impossibles around us. Racial injustice, climate change, the oppression and abuse of those without power, the need to reform our economic, political, and healthcare systems, and all of this while trying to survive a pandemic. Historically speaking, I think this is one of those times when the cries of the suffering are being raised loud and clear. God hears those cries, and God will respond. The question for us is, which side will we be on? Will we be those who are listening for God's voice so that we can be a part of God's redemptive plan? Or will we be those who are the ones causing the pain that God needs to eliminate? In our current situation, there have been and will continue to be those whom God calls by name, those whom God meets in some sort of burning bush moment with a monumental plan of action that is designed to make a major change for the better. You could be one of those people. If so, I pray that you will respond with courage and with faith, and that you will know that the God who is I am goes with you and will be for you whatever you need God to be. You may be one of those that history records as a force for good because you chose to cause some good trouble. If so, may God bless you, and we give you our thanks. Now, not all of us are called for such monumental divine assignments. Most of us, in fact, are called to participate in God's plan of redemption in much smaller ways. Very few of us have burning bush moments with God. But that doesn't mean that God isn't calling us, that God isn't encountering us and preparing us for a mission. God calls all of us to some mission of justice and love in this world, one way or the other. So for the rest of us, our divine encounter may be better reflected in another story in the Bible, one that we find in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John. It is in that chapter that we read about a woman at a well who also encountered God and who through that encounter discovered her own mission to share the good news that God hears the cry of the oppressed and God comes to set people free. The woman is from Samaria, which makes her an outcast in the eyes of the Israelites, even though the Samaritans were themselves descended from the same ancestors as the Israelites. She also seems to have a checkered past, which makes her an outcast even among her own people. And yet it is this woman to whom Jesus chooses to first reveal his true identity. As the two exchange banter and theological insights and ideas there at the well of Jacob, She makes it clear to Jesus that she knows the stories of her people's ancestors, of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and yes, even of Moses. And she knows the stories about the prophecies of a coming Messiah. So imagine the shock she must have felt when Jesus said to her, "I am." In this stunning revelation, Jesus has told this woman, whom no one else has seen as worthy of attention, that he, the man talking to her there at the well, is the same God who spoke to Moses out of a burning bush. Is it any wonder that she dropped her bucket and ran back to her village to tell anybody she could meet the good news that God had heard the cries of her people and had come to set them free? That is the message and the mission God gives to all of us who choose to follow Jesus. We may not be called to knock a Pharaoh off of his throne. We may not be called to lead an entire nation to freedom through the wilderness. Yet we are called to share the good news that God hears our cries of those who suffer, the cries of those who are oppressed. And God comes to set us free. This is a divinely given mission that will turn the world upside down, even if it isn't in as grand a manner as that of Moses. That is the mission and the message God gives to all of us who choose to follow Christ. We may not be called to knock a Pharaoh off of his throne. We may not be called to lead an entire people to freedom through a wilderness. Yet we are given a divine mission to share the good news that God hears the cry of the oppressed and God comes to set them free. Through that divine mission, we are called to simply love the people around us, to seek justice within our communities, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. We are called to offer compassion and care in whatever ways God makes possible. And most of all, we are called to declare that good news. God hears, God cares, and God acts. God will bring down the powerful governments, the powerful institutions, and the powerful people who use their power to oppress and to abuse. Now, this may still sound like a mission impossible, but with the great I Am going with us and being for us, whatever it is we need God to be in the moment, we will make a difference. With God's help, we can move mountains. It may be one rock or even just one pebble at a time, but we will move mountains. So whatever call God has placed on your life, whether it came from a burning bush or just standing at the kitchen sink, know this: it is time to put our shoes back on and to go out and to make a difference for good in this world. God has given us a mission to accomplish, and with God's help, it is not impossible. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.